Sometimes reality is far more unpredictable and unsettling than any fiction we could write. We like to think we have a firm grip on our lives, that our spaces are safe, and that the people around us are exactly who they claim to be. But every now and then, a series of events shatters that illusion. Today, we're going to look at three different stories that show just how fragile our understanding of the world really is. In one case, a man lives for decades unaware of a danger lurking in his chest. In another, a brilliant mind gets caught up in international espionage, ending up in a situation so bizarre investigators still argue about it today. And in our final story, a normal afternoon turns into a struggle for survival, where tragic miscommunications lead to a heartbreaking end. These stories remind us that danger, mystery, and the unimaginable are often hiding just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Let's start in 2013 with a 46-year-old man named Paul Baxter. Paul was an ordinary guy who lived a relatively quiet life, but one day he started feeling a little under the weather. It began with a slight tickle, but over a couple of days it escalated into a massive cough. This wasn't a normal cold. It was a deep, chest-racking cough that became so constant, Paul could barely speak. Every time he tried to form a sentence, he would descend into another fit of coughing. Seeing that this was not getting any better, Paul decided to go see his doctor. The doctor listened to Paul's chest, heard the congestion, and quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia. This seemed like a very logical explanation, so the doctor put Paul on a treatment plan, which included a course of antibiotics and some rest. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. At the clinic, the specialists did an X-ray of his chest, and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker. They worried it could be cancer, but before they put him under the knife to cut this shadow out, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it, feed it down into his lungs, and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw a distinct lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. He told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, so he pulled the probe out and told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days. Paul looked at the doctor, completely bewildered, and asked what that orange thing inside of his lung could possibly be. The doctor said he honestly had no idea, but it was definitely not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure. The doctor, using a longer and more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lung. As soon as he pulled it free, everyone in the room watched the camera screen in real time. It was a small, triangular orange thing that nobody recognized. Finally, the pincers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. It was a small, plastic, orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. As soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him. He told the doctors that when he was 7 years old, he had inhaled a tiny toy traffic cone, but he thought he had swallowed it. Somehow, for over 40 years, he had lived with no symptoms at all, until his body finally reacted to it. Paul said that when he had this sudden revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing. None of the doctors had ever seen anything like it before. Paul was allowed to keep his tiny orange traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. But the problem was, how could someone live with plastic in their lung for over 40 years without noticing? The specialists realized that because Paul was so young, his airway adapted to the plastic. Tissue grew around it, forming a lump that kept it isolated. It was only when he grew older and his lungs changed from smoking that the tissue became irritated, triggering the cough that led to the discovery. Our second story takes us to the United Kingdom, and it involves a man named Gareth Williams. From the time Gareth was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England, and after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted, dropped out of Cambridge, and moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, where GCHQ is located. There, he would live and work for the next 10 years. Gareth was an intensely private and shy person, but he was a highly valued team player whose genius helped his group win several top awards. In 2009, Britain's famous secret intelligence service, MI6, was so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job. This was a rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a real-life spy. He jumped at the chance, but shortly after moving to London, he regretted his decision. He absolutely hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars, the flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared that he was quiet, but at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. He eventually decided to transfer back to GCHQ, but before he left, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London, and for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anyone looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer, the officer got the key from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth, but there was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs, still calling for him. When he got to the second floor, he found a closed bathroom door. What he found on the other side of that door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and in the bathtub, there was a big red zippered duffel bag. Inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was lying directly underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were absolutely no fingerprints anywhere in the bathtub, on the bag itself, on the zippers, on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby on a table, and it had been completely reset to factory settings. Investigators would later determine that his phone had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on street security cameras, and also the day they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it, there was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed no drugs or alcohol in his system. But the thermostat inside the apartment was turned way up, making it extremely hot inside despite it being the height of summer in August. This excessive heat sped up the decomposition process, which made it impossible for the coroner to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mob, which would have made him a target. Another theory is that MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent believed there was a cover-up. He stated that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it down, removing all fingerprints and DNA. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least once he had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrists to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar-sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it, despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, the lock, the zippers, or the tub? When he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the massive red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident, and the case was closed 3 years after his body was found. But for his family, the unanswered questions still linger. They have always maintained that a brilliant mind like Gareth, who was working on highly sensitive international security operations, was likely targeted by professionals who knew exactly how to make a murder look like an impossible self-inflicted accident. On the afternoon of April 10th, 2018, 16-year-old Kyle Plush had just finished classes at Seven Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. He walked out the school's doors and began walking straight across towards the sophomore parking lot where his car, a gold Honda Odyssey minivan, was located. Although Kyle had suffered a spinal cord injury at a young age, he made a remarkable recovery. He ran, biked, swam, and played soccer. But tennis was his favorite. He had joined the high school tennis team and become one of their best players. That afternoon, he had a match scheduled, so he needed to get into his minivan and get out his tennis racket and his tennis shoes. He made it to the vehicle a little bit after 3 in the afternoon, slid open the door, threw his backpack inside, and then climbed toward the third row seat of the van where his sneakers were sitting. He got to the third row, turned around, and sat down facing the front of the minivan. He took off his school shoes, put on his tennis shoes, and then he got up onto his knees and turned around so he was facing the back of the van. His knees were on the third row seat, and he began reaching down into the trunk well to reach for his bag that contained his tennis racket. As he was reaching, the third row seat itself, which he was kneeling on, suddenly flipped backwards, dumping him headfirst into the trunk. Except all of Kyle's body did not just go tumbling into the trunk space. Tinma, his upper half, made it about halfway down, and then he got stuck upside down when the top of that heavy third row seat caught his chest and pressed it tightly up against the back hatch of the van. Kyle was completely upside down, and his hands were free in the trunk space, but they were too close to the floor where he couldn't really press himself out of this position. This third row seat had come loose, and because it was not locked in position, if he tried to move up at all, the seat went with him, and if he came down, the seat came with him too. Even trying to push himself back out again was impossible because he couldn't clear the seat. He probably looked for places to pull himself down, hoping that might be a way to clear the obstruction, but there was nothing to grab onto, and his lower half would not have been able to slip through that gap, even if the seat was stationary. No person is supposed to get through that tiny little gap, and there was also no inside handle on the back hatch that Kyle could have grabbed to potentially open the door. He was entirely reliant on somebody showing up and opening the trunk from the outside. But the scariest part of this situation was that loose third row seat weighed nearly 100 pounds, and it was driving directly against his chest, crushing his lungs with every passing second. He would have had to fight with every single breath he took, pushing up against that 100 pounds just to get a marginal gasp of air. Worse than that, if Kyle didn't constantly put air into his chest and keep it full and strong, that seat would literally crush his chest and kill him. Kyle knew he had to find a way to signal someone that he was in this car. He couldn't reach his phone because it was up in his pants pocket, and trying to reach it meant getting around the seat, which he couldn't do. But he had a smartphone, and he knew he could use voice-assisted calling. At 3:14 in the afternoon, he used his iPhone's voice assistant, Siri, to call 911. As soon as the dispatcher picked up, Kyle was frantic, yelling for help, saying he was trapped in a minivan in the Seven Hills parking lot, and someone needed to get him out. But the dispatcher couldn't really understand what Kyle was saying because he was yelling from deep inside the trunk space up to his phone in his pocket. The dispatcher was just having a hard time understanding him, although if you listen to the audio, it is plainly clear that Kyle is in extreme distress. You can hear him yelling and you can hear him banging on the inside of the car. The dispatcher kept asking where he was, but Kyle couldn't hear his phone, so he just kept frantically repeating his situation, saying his name, where he was located, and what was happening to him, hoping that someone on the other end of the line would understand and come save him. Toward the end of the call, Kyle tells the dispatcher that he thinks he is going to die here, and when the call cuts out, the dispatcher tries calling back, but it goes straight to voicemail. The voicemail only indicated his name was Kyle. Not knowing if this was real or a hoax, the dispatcher wrongly labeled the call as unknown trouble when they broadcasted it to the police, and they did not communicate that the caller was obviously in distress, screaming and banging. Had the dispatcher given Kyle's call a higher priority, fire and rescue would have been alerted, and they could have used their advanced mapping technologies to pinpoint where his cell phone was. Instead, local police were sent to the Seven Hills High School area to look around the different parking lots. But there was nearly a dozen of these parking lots associated with the school, making it a huge search area. And again, these police officers were not even aware of what they were looking for. They were looking for unknown trouble associated with some caller somewhere around this huge high school. The police showed up and began kind of meandering through the parking lots, staying inside their patrol vehicles and just looking around. They didn't see any obvious problems, although in reality, they were right near Kyle's gold minivan the entire time. At 3:35, with the police still patrolling the parking lots, Kyle used Siri to call 911 again, and a different dispatcher answered. At this point, it had been 21 minutes since his first call, and the weight of that heavy seat was becoming unbearable. His voice was very weak and faint. You can tell he had highly labored breathing, and every word was punctuated with a long silence as he tried to get out anything he could to help himself. He told the dispatcher, "If I die, I need you to tell my mother that I love her." There was a long silence, and Kyle asked them if they could hear him. He told them this was not a joke, that he was trapped in his gold minivan in the Seven Hills sophomore parking lot, and if they didn't get there soon, he was going to die. He kept saying, hey Siri," trying to keep the phone active, but then it went completely silent. The second dispatcher heard Kyle on this call, but for some reason did not relay to the patrolling officers Kyle's dire situation or his exact position. They didn't tell the officers that he was in a gold Honda Odyssey in the sophomore parking lot. That critical information was never communicated, and so just 2 minutes after the second call ended, the officers left the school thinking there was no trouble. Kyle was left entirely alone in the dark. 6 hours later, Kyle's father went out looking for him after he didn't come home from his tennis match. He used an iPad tracking application to locate his son's phone, which pointed him directly to the school. He drove there and found the gold minivan parked in the sophomore parking lot. But when he ran up and opened the vehicle, it was already too late. His son was still trapped upside down in the trunk space, and he had passed away after the heavy seat finally crushed his chest, causing him to asphyxiate. The medical examiner later confirmed that the heavy seat had slowly compressed his chest, preventing him from breathing, and he had died of positional asphyxiation. Kyle's family was absolutely devastated by the tragic loss of their son, and they filed a major wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Cincinnati and several employees involved. They sought to ensure that such a catastrophic breakdown in the emergency system would never happen to another family again. The legal proceedings and the fight for accountability would continue for years, leaving a deep, lingering sadness over the entire high school community and a tragic, permanent reminder of how a series of small, avoidable human errors can lead to the loss of an extraordinary young life filled with so much potential. Some mysteries eventually get answers. Others never do. And of the 3 stories you heard today, at least one still leaves more questions than answers. If stories like these fascinate you, there's another unbelievable true case waiting in the next video. Go check it out and see if you can figure that one out before the experts did. Sometimes the things we think are there to protect us, or the people we think we know best, turn out to be the exact things that are trying to destroy us. It is a terrifying realization, but it happens more often than you might think. Today, we are going to look at 3 cases where ordinary people went about their daily lives expecting nothing but their usual routines, only to find themselves caught in a terrifying fight for survival against a threat they never saw coming. Our first story takes us to the afternoon of the 22nd of January 2024 in the city of Newcastle, England. An elderly woman named Janet Lee was sitting in front of her computer in an office on the 2nd floor of her home. It was a cold, typical gray afternoon, and Janet was trying to focus on her recent bank statements. But it was incredibly hard for her to concentrate. She was constantly distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. Janet's boyfriend was a man named Richard O'Connell. He and Janet had been together for about 20 years now. Even though they were not officially married, they functioned just like any married couple. They lived together, they shared their daily routines, and they planned their future together. In fact, Janet loved Richard so much and trusted him so completely that she had even written him into her will, ensuring he would be taken care of if anything happened to her. But lately, their relationship had become pretty rocky. In the weeks leading up to this afternoon, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Nothing was set in stone, and they had not made a final decision. But the mere mention of a breakup was a sudden, heavy possibility that was really hard for Janet to deal with. As she sat upstairs in her office, trying to make sense of the numbers on her screen, she kept getting completely sidetracked by the sound of Richard's voice downstairs. She could not stop wondering what would happen if they broke up. What would her life look like? Where would she go? Her mind wandered far away from her bank statements, filled with a deep sense of uncertainty about the future. And then, as Janet was lost in these thoughts, she suddenly heard Richard start yelling downstairs. At first, it sounded like he might just be calling out to the person he had been talking to. But as Janet stopped and listened more closely, the tone of his voice changed. He was not just shouting. He was screaming in intense pain. It was a sound of pure agony. Janet immediately pushed her chair back, ran out of her office, and rushed down the stairs to see what was happening. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked toward the front door. She saw a man walking out. He was wearing a white lab coat, a medical mask, and glasses. His back was to her, and he quickly slipped out the door and closed it behind him. Before Janet could even begin to process who this strange man was or what he was doing in her home, she heard Richard groan. She turned toward the living room and saw Richard clutching his shoulder. He was grimacing, his face pale, rocking back and forth in obvious, intense physical distress. Janet rushed over to him, panic rising in her chest. She asked him what was wrong, what had happened, and who that man was. Richard, breathing heavily and grinding his teeth, told her that he had just received a COVID-19 vaccine booster shot and it hurt incredibly bad. He explained that the man who had just left was a nurse from the National Health Service, or the NHS, who had come by the house to administer the shot. Janet listened to his explanation, but it did not make sense to her. She wondered why Richard was getting a routine vaccine administered at home by a traveling nurse instead of going to a local pharmacy or a doctor's clinic. It felt highly unusual. But as she looked at Richard, she realized that his pain was very real and very severe. He was moaning, holding his arm tight against his chest, and could barely stand still. She decided to put her questions aside and focus on helping him. She asked him if he wanted her to drive him to the hospital right away. But Richard shook his head. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down, and said that the nurse had told him this specific vaccine had a very strong physical reaction. The nurse had assured him that severe pain at the injection site was normal and would fade on its own. Richard insisted they just wait it out. Janet was still deeply worried, but since Richard seemed confident in what the nurse had told him, she decided to respect his wish. She went back upstairs to her office, though she could no longer focus on her bank statements at all. But the pain did not go away. Over the next 48 hours, Richard's condition grew progressively worse. The spot on his arm where he had been injected began to swell. It turned a dark, angry red, and then it began to blister and bleed. By the second day, the tissue around the wound had turned completely black. It looked as if his flesh was literally rotting on his body. Terrified by what they were seeing, Janet put her foot down, got Richard into the car, and rushed him to the emergency room. At the hospital, the doctors took one look at Richard's arm and rushed him into an examination room. The diagnosis was horrifying. Richard was suffering from necrotizing fasciitis, a severe and rapidly spreading bacterial infection commonly known as flesh-eating disease. The bacteria were destroying the skin, fat, and muscle tissue in his arm, essentially rotting him from the inside out. The doctors told Richard that he needed emergency surgery immediately to cut away the dead and dying flesh to stop the infection from spreading to his bloodstream and killing him. But before they wheeled him into surgery, the medical team needed to understand how this had happened. Necrotizing fasciitis usually requires a pathway into the body, like a contaminated wound. Richard explained that the symptoms had started immediately after he received his booster shot from the NHS nurse at his home. As Richard described the encounter to the doctors, Janet sat nearby, listening intently. Richard went into detail about the nurse's appearance, mentioning his height, his build, the way he carried himself, and his slightly unusual accent under his medical mask. And as Richard spoke, something suddenly clicked in Janet's mind. A wave of cold, paralyzing horror washed over her. She realized why the man in the white lab coat had looked so strangely familiar to her when she saw him walking out the door. It was not a stranger. It was not an NHS nurse at all. It turns out the man who had entered their home was Janet's own son, Thomas Kwan. Thomas Kwan was a respected, practicing general practitioner, a medical doctor who knew exactly how the healthcare system worked. But he had not come to his mother's house to help. He had arrived in an elaborate disguise, wearing a fake beard, a mustache, a clinical mask, protective eyewear, and a wig. He had used his medical knowledge to forge official-looking NHS letters, complete with logos and reference numbers, which he had sent to Richard to convince him that he was scheduled for a routine home vaccination. When the police were called to the hospital, they launched an immediate and massive investigation. They went to the house in Newcastle, secured neighbors' security camera footage, and began tracking the movements of the mysterious nurse. The footage showed a disguised man arriving and leaving the property, and the police were able to trace his vehicle back to Thomas Kwan's residence in Sunderland. When detectives raided Thomas's home, they discovered a terrifying scene. He had established a secret laboratory space containing a massive collection of dangerous chemicals and lethal poisons, including ricin, cyanide, and a highly toxic industrial pesticide called iodimethane. On his computer, detectives found a digital diary and detailed search histories showing that Thomas had been planning the murder for months. He had researched lethal doses, how to administer poisons undetected, and had even installed tracking software on his mother's phone to monitor her daily movements so he would know exactly when she would be home and when she would be upstairs. The motive behind this horrific act was pure greed and resentment. Thomas had discovered that his mother had written Richard into her will, and he was absolutely furious. He was convinced that Richard was a gold digger who was going to steal his inheritance and get his hands on his mother's valuable house. Thomas decided that the only way to secure the inheritance for himself was to eliminate Richard. He planned to inject him with a lethal substance, hoping it would look like a sudden, tragic medical complication from a vaccine, shielding him from any suspicion. But instead of a clean, silent poison, Thomas had injected Richard with iodomethane. The industrial pesticide immediately caused severe chemical burns within Richard's muscle tissue, leading to the rapid development of the flesh-eating bacteria. Richard survived the ordeal, but only after undergoing multiple, intense, painful surgeries and skin grafts to save his arm. He was left with permanent physical scars and deep psychological trauma. As for Thomas Kwan, his elaborate plan fell completely apart under the weight of the forensic evidence. He was arrested, put on trial, and convicted of attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to 31 years in prison. Janet was left to pick up the pieces of her life, carrying the devastating knowledge that her own son had attempted to murder the man she loved out of nothing but cold, calculated greed. Sometimes the danger comes from a family member hiding behind a complex disguise. But other times, the danger is something completely invisible, waiting for us in the most beautiful, peaceful places, just like what happened to a young woman named Angela Lyons. On a bright, sunny afternoon in August of 2014, a 24-year-old tourist from Glasgow, Scotland, who we will call Angela Lyons, was riding a rented moped through the busy, chaotic streets of Vietnam. Angela had arrived in the country about a week earlier, and so far her vacation had been absolutely perfect. She had spent her days exploring the vibrant city, visiting bustling nightclubs, trying incredible local street food, and swimming in beautiful, cool rivers to escape the tropical heat. She felt completely free and happy. As she cruised slowly down a busy street on her moped, she was taking in the sights and sounds of the city, looking at the colorful shop fronts. For just a second, she turned her head to look at something on the side of the road. But in that split second, the traffic in front of her slowed down. When she looked back, she couldn't react in time. Her moped hit another scooter in front of her with a loud crash, and Angela was thrown off her bike, tumbling onto the hard concrete pavement. She hit her head pretty hard on the ground. Fortunately, she was wearing a helmet, which absorbed the brunt of the impact. Shaken, but determined to stay calm, Angela stood up and assessed her body. She seemed to be physically fine, with no major cuts or broken bones. The driver of the other moped was also unhurt, and both of their bikes had escaped any serious damage. They apologized to each other, nodded, and decided to just go their separate ways. Angela walked over to the side of the road, took off her helmet, and ran her fingers through her hair to check her scalp. She felt a small, tender bump where her head had made contact with the road, but it did not seem serious. She briefly considered going to a local medical clinic just to get checked out, but decided against it. It was a very small bump, and she did not want to spend her precious vacation time waiting in a hospital. She put her helmet back on, got back on her moped, and continued her trip. She spent a few more days in Vietnam, enjoying the warm weather and swimming in the local freshwater rivers before finally boarding her flight back to Scotland. But almost as soon as she landed back home in Glasgow, she began to experience a very strange and highly alarming new symptom. Out of nowhere, her nose began to bleed. And these were not minor, occasional nosebleeds. They were sudden, heavy, and occurred multiple times a day, pouring blood without any warning. Terrified that she had sustained some kind of internal head injury or a brain bleed from her moped accident, Angela immediately made an appointment to see her primary care doctor. She sat in the examination room and explained everything to the doctor, telling him about the moped crash, the bump on her head, and the severe nosebleeds that had started the moment she returned to Scotland. The doctor listened carefully, examined her head and her nose, and checked her vitals. But after he was finished, he smiled and shook his head. He told Angela that he did not believe her nosebleeds had anything to do with the moped crash. He pointed out that the bump on her head had already completely healed and there were no signs of concussion. Instead, he explained that her body was likely just having a hard time adjusting to the dramatic change in weather. She had gone from the extreme humid heat of Vietnam to the cold, dry air of Scotland, which can cause the delicate blood vessels inside the nasal passages to dry out and burst. The doctor recommended that Angela apply a small amount of Vaseline inside her nostrils several times a day to keep the tissue moist and lubricated. He assured her that once her body fully transitioned back to the local climate, the nosebleeds would stop. Angela felt incredibly relieved. She went home, bought a jar of Vaseline, and began applying it diligently every morning and evening. But the nosebleeds did not stop. If anything, they got worse. They became more frequent, and she found herself constantly carrying tissues everywhere she went. A few days later, Angela was in her bathroom, getting ready to take a warm shower. She applied some Vaseline to her nose, turned on the water, and stepped inside the steaming tub. As she stood under the warm water, she began gently feeling her nose, trying to see if there was any internal swelling. As she pressed her fingers against her nostril, she felt something strange and solid deep inside her nasal cavity. It felt like a firm, unusual blockage. Curious and frustrated, she pressed down hard on the outside of her nose, trying to feel what it was. The moment she applied pressure, a blinding, white-hot wave of pain shot through her face. She gasped, and instantly a torrent of blood began pouring out of her nose. It was not a typical nosebleed. It was a heavy, continuous flow of blood that she could not stop. The blood covered her hands and stained the shower floor. Panic seized her. She jumped out of the shower, wrapped herself in a towel, and tried to pack her nose with tissues, but the blood kept soaking through them. She was convinced that she was suffering from a catastrophic brain hemorrhage from the moped crash that the doctor had completely missed. Shaking with fear, she threw on some clothes, ran to her car, and drove straight to the nearest hospital emergency room. When she arrived, the emergency room staff saw how pale and terrified she was and quickly brought her into an exam room. A nurse instructed her to sit down, tilt her head back, and keep pressure on her nose. The nurse then took a medical light and speculum forceps and began looking into Angela's nostrils. Angela sat perfectly still, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the nurse to tell her what was wrong. But as the minutes ticked by, the room became incredibly quiet. The nurse did not say a word. She was completely motionless. Feeling a sudden wave of unease, Angela slowly tilted her head down to look at the nurse. The nurse was standing there, frozen. Her eyes were wide with a look of absolute horror and disbelief. She was staring into Angela's nose as if she had just seen something impossible. The nurse quickly tried to compose herself, looked at Angela, and told her to stay extremely calm while she went to get the doctor. Before Angela could even ask what was happening, the nurse turned and rushed out of the room. A few minutes later, a doctor arrived with specialized tools. He leaned in, examined Angela's nose, and confirmed what the nurse had seen. It turned out that Angela's primary care doctor had been right about one thing. The nosebleeds had nothing to do with her moped accident. But they were not caused by the Scottish weather either. While Angela had been swimming in the beautiful freshwater rivers of Vietnam, a tiny, microscopic creature had swam up her nose. It was a juvenile leech. Once inside her warm, dark, and highly vascular nasal cavity, the leech had latched onto her sinus tissue and began feeding on her blood. Over the next several weeks, as Angela traveled back to Scotland, the leech grew larger and larger, completely undetected. By the time she stood in the hospital, the leech had grown to a massive 3 inches in length. It had been living deep inside her sinus cavity, separated from her brain only by a paper-thin bone called the cribriform plate, which is only about 0.5 millimeter thick. Every time Angela experienced a sudden nosebleed, it was actually the leech feeding and moving around inside her face. When she had pressed down hard on her nose in the shower, she had squeezed the leech, causing it to bite down in pain and rupture a major blood vessel, triggering the massive hemorrhage. The doctor had to perform a highly delicate and uncomfortable procedure. Using long, thin forceps and a local anesthetic, he carefully reached deep into Angela's nose to grasp the slippery, writhing parasite. He had to be extremely careful not to tear the leech, which would leave its mouthparts embedded in her tissue, potentially causing a severe infection. After 30 tense, agonizing minutes, the doctor slowly pulled the 3-inch-long black leech out of Angela's nose. Angela watched in utter disgust as the wet, writhing creature was placed into a medical tray. With the parasite finally removed, her nose was cleaned and the bleeding stopped. Angela went on to make a full physical recovery, but the psychological horror of knowing a giant blood-sucking worm had been living inside her face for weeks was something she would never truly get over. It is terrifying to think about what can enter our bodies when we are just trying to enjoy a beautiful vacation. But our final story shows that sometimes the most deadly poison is introduced to us slowly over months by someone we share our home with. In February of 1987, a 45-year-old woman named Janet Overton stood in front of her bathroom mirror inside her beautiful home in Dana Point, California. Janet was a highly respected and active member of her community. She served on the school board for the Capistrano Unified School District, where her 17-year-old son Eric went to school. She had a major school board meeting scheduled for later that day, and she was determined to attend. But as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she looked absolutely terrible. Her skin was a sickly, pale yellow, and she had deep, dark purple circles under her eyes. Janet knew why she looked this way. For the past couple of days, she had been feeling incredibly sick out of nowhere. She was completely congested, felt constantly fatigued, and suffered from sudden, violent waves of nausea that kept her awake at night. She figured she had just contracted a particularly bad winter cold or a flu virus. Janet was a very strong-willed woman, and she hated showing weakness or canceling her obligations. She decided that instead of going to the doctor, she would just tough it out. She applied a thick layer of heavy makeup to cover up her pale complexion, styled her hair, drank a hot cup of coffee, and walked out the door to her meeting. But as the weeks went by, Janet's condition did not get any better. In fact, it steadily got worse. One night, she woke up in the middle of the night with a wave of nausea so violent that she barely made it to the bathroom before she began vomiting. She was left sitting on the cold bathroom floor, sweating, shaking, and gasping for breath. She had finally gone to see a doctor, but the medical examinations had yielded no clear answers. The doctor agreed that she was likely fighting a persistent, stubborn viral infection and told her to get plenty of rest and stay hydrated. But rest did not help. The nausea became a constant, agonizing presence in her life, making it nearly impossible for her to eat. She began to lose weight rapidly, and she became so weak that she could barely stand up. She began falling behind on her important work with the school board because she simply did not have the energy to function. One night, as she was splashing cold water on her face in the bathroom, she noticed a new and alarming symptom. She saw a strange, red, scaly rash on her arms. She pulled her sleeves up and saw that the rash extended all the way up her arms, onto her shoulders, her neck, and down her back. When she touched it, it burned with a sharp, agonizing pain. This was a brand new symptom, and it was clear to Janet that it had to be connected to whatever mystery illness was destroying her body. Terrified by how rapidly her health was deteriorating, she decided she could no longer ignore it. She went to the emergency room. The next day, Janet was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm. Her husband, Richard Overton, a highly intelligent man with a doctorate in psychology, sat faithfully at our bedside along with their son, Eric. Janet looked incredibly frail. The red rash had now spread to her neck and face, where it had begun to form painful blisters. The hospital doctors ran a series of advanced tests, looking for everything from autoimmune diseases to rare infections. But every single test came back negative. She did not have the flu, she did not have any known infection, and her blood work showed no obvious abnormalities. However, an abdominal scan did reveal something concrete. Janet's stomach was covered in deep, bleeding ulcers. The doctors explained that these ulcers were the direct cause of her severe nausea and inability to keep food down. But they could not explain why a healthy, active 45-year-old woman would suddenly develop such severe ulcers. With no clear diagnosis, the doctors could only treat her symptoms. They put her on heavy ulcer medication and gave her specialized topical creams for her painful, blistering rash. Surprisingly, the treatments worked. Over the next few days, her stomach settled, the rash began to fade, and she regained enough strength to be discharged from the hospital. Janet and her family returned home, hoping that this bizarre, terrifying medical nightmare was finally over. But it was not. Over the next several months, a cruel and exhausting cycle began. Janet would feel perfectly healthy for a few weeks, only to suddenly fall violently ill again with the exact same symptoms. She would develop severe nausea, extreme weakness, and the painful, blistering rash. She was hospitalized multiple times, but each time the doctors were completely baffled, treated her symptoms, and sent her home once she stabilized. By the 24th of January, 1988, Janet was determined to have a good day. She and her son, Eric, had planned an exciting whale-watching trip. She woke up feeling terrible, experiencing the familiar onset of nausea and weakness, but she refused to let her mysterious illness ruin this special day with her son. She went through her routine to hide her sickness. She applied a heavy layer of foundation and blush to cover her pale skin. She styled her hair, drank a freshly brewed cup of hot coffee to give herself a boost of energy, and walked downstairs to meet Eric. Together, they walked out of the house and stepped onto the driveway. Janet approached the passenger side of the family car. She reached out her hand, her fingers inches from the door handle. Suddenly, she froze. She gasps, her eyes went wide, and she collapsed onto the concrete driveway. Eric and his father, Richard, rushed to her side, desperately calling for help. They transported her to the hospital as quickly as possible. But by the time they arrived, it was already too late. Janet Overton was pronounced dead. The medical community was stunned. A woman who had been suffering from a mysterious undulating illness for over a year had suddenly dropped dead. Because of the unusual circumstances surrounding her death, a coroner was called to perform a thorough autopsy to determine once and for all what had killed Janet. During the autopsy, the coroner made the initial incision and opened Janet's stomach. As he did, he was immediately struck by a highly distinct, powerful aroma filling the room. It was a sweet, bitter scent, resembling the smell of wild almonds. The coroner immediately recognized this smell. It was the signature scent of cyanide. The coroner halted the autopsy and immediately contacted the local police department. Detectives were dispatched to the Overton home in Dana Point. They began a comprehensive search of the property, seizing various items including Janet's personal belongings, cosmetics, food, and beverages. The physical evidence was sent to a forensic toxicology laboratory for analysis. The results of the tests were shocking and broke the mystery wide open. The detectives discovered that Janet had not been suffering from a rare, mysterious medical illness at all. She was being systematically and slowly poisoned. Forensic analysis of her makeup, specifically her eyeliner and foundation, revealed they were heavily contaminated with selenium, a trace mineral that is highly toxic to humans in large doses. Prolonged selenium poisoning causes severe nausea, extreme fatigue, hair loss, and a painful, peeling skin rash that blisters. This was the source of the mysterious burning rash that the doctors could never diagnose. Every time Janet caked on heavy makeup to hide her illness and look presentable, she was actually rubbing a highly toxic chemical directly into her skin, allowing it to absorb into her bloodstream and slowly poison her body. But the selenium was a slow killer, designed to make her suffer and slowly waste away. The final fatal blow had come on the morning of the 24th of January, 1988. Forensic testing of the coffee cup Janet drank from before her collapse revealed a lethal concentration of cyanide. The cyanide acted instantly, shutting down her body's ability to use oxygen and causing her immediate collapse and death. The police turned their full attention to her husband, Richard Overton. As they dug into Richard's background and personal life, they uncovered a dark and disturbing motive. Richard, despite his professional standing as a psychologist, was a deeply jealous, controlling, and resentful man. He had become absolutely convinced that Janet was having an extramarital affair. The police found that Richard had access to highly toxic chemicals through his professional networks and interests. Most damning of all, they discovered his personal journals, which were written in a highly complex, self-made shorthand code. When experts deciphered the code, they found that Richard had kept a meticulous daily record of his suspicions, tracking Janet's schedule and documenting her physical decline. In his diary, Richard had documented exactly how he was secretly placing selenium in her makeup and watching her suffer. He had also documented his decision to end her life with a fatal dose of cyanide when the slow selenium poisoning was taking too long. Richard Overton was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial was a massive sensation in Orange County, California. The prosecution presented the deciphered coded diaries, the contaminated makeup, the cyanide-laced coffee cup, and the expert testimony of the coroner. Despite Richard's defense attempting to claim that Janet's death was a suicide or due to natural causes, the jury was convinced by the overwhelming forensic evidence. In 1995, Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He continued to maintain his innocence from behind bars, but all of his appeals were denied. He died in a state prison in 2009. The tragic story of Janet Overton leaves a lingering, haunting resonance. A dedicated mother, public servant, and beloved community member was slowly tortured and ultimately murdered by the very person she trusted most, her husband, who watched her suffer for over a year, pretending to comfort her while secretly ensuring her demise. These three cases show us that sometimes the world is far more dangerous than we realize. Whether it is a greedy family member hiding behind a medical disguise, a silent parasite waiting in a beautiful river, or a jealous spouse hiding poison in the everyday items we trust, the line between safety and tragedy is often incredibly thin. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the afternoon of October 11th, 2016, a middle-aged man named Carlos Herrera Sr. entered the visitation area of a prison in Venezuela. The room itself sort of looked like a high school cafeteria with tables and chairs everywhere for the inmates and their visitors to sit down and have their meetings. And right in front of was one table where there was this bedraggled-looking prisoner who Carlos was there to meet. As Carlos got closer to this guy, he could see he really looked terrible, the inmate. I mean, his cheekbones were sticking out. He was sort of emaciated. He was bloodied and bruised. He had bandages on his arm. And also, as Carlos moved towards this guy, he could clearly see all the guards that lined the walls and the exits of this visitation area sort of squirm with discomfort, as this meeting is about to take place. And Carlos had a good idea why these guards might be anxious. And that is because, over the past month, this prison had been on lockdown because a gang inside the prison had risen up and overpowered the guards and completely taken over for this entire month. And just to be clear, during this month, people died as a result of this takeover. This was a horrible month for this prison. And it was only over the past couple of days that the guards were finally able to take back control. Carlos knew all this not only because this riot was all over the news while it was going on, but also because his own son, Juan Herrera Jr., was serving time in this prison for robbery. He had been for the past year. However, Carlos was not coming to visit his son right now. Instead, he was coming to visit a different prisoner because during this riot, Juan Jr. had just disappeared. And Carlos, when he had found out about that, had called prison officials, other people, politicians, you name it, to try to figure out where his son went. But nobody seemed to know. And so finally, he had found this one prisoner, the guy he was meeting today, this beaten-down looking guy who had agreed to come forward and tell Carlos what he knew about what happened to Juan Jr. And so Carlos sat down at this table with this prisoner. And after the two of them introduced themselves, very quickly, Carlos said, "Please, tell me what happened to my son. Where is he?" But this prisoner he was talking to did not immediately get into sort of a clear story about Juan Jr. This guy began talking about a totally separate prisoner, a man named Doran Hell Vargas. Vargas was notorious across Venezuela for a series of brutal murders he committed that ultimately put him in this prison. And during this recent riot at this prison, it was Vargas and his gang that rose up and took over. Vargas was in charge, effectively, of the entire riot. And so even though he was terrorizing people and brutalizing people and was very much responsible for the deaths of multiple inmates, he also, at the same time, did have to make sure that the people he was illegally in charge of had enough food, they had enough supplies, and they had the basic things they needed to survive. And so Carlos is listening to this man sort of lay this out about Vargas and sort of how he was in control during this riot. And Carlos was just confused. He did not understand why the man was explaining the minor details of what Vargas was doing during the riot when his own son was missing. Carlos looked at the man and said, "I just do not get it. Why are you explaining all of this to me? What does this have to do with my son?" The prisoner pointed to the bandage on his arm and pointed at all of his injuries. He told Carlos that if anybody got in the way of Vargas, they were beaten to within an inch of their lives, and some were killed. Carlos asked if that was what happened to his son, if he had been beaten by Vargas. But at that point, the prisoner just shook his head and said no. He looked down, unable to make eye contact, and said, "What happened to your son was much worse." The prisoner explained that during the riot, Juan Jr. was tapped by Vargas to help with something. Everyone had to do what Vargas asked, otherwise they would be beaten or killed. Ultimately, Juan Jr. agreed to help Vargas distribute food to the inmates. Because of the riot, the prison had been locked down, food supplies were restricted, and inmates were beginning to starve. Juan Jr. was told he needed to help provide food to these inmates. He agreed to do it, at which point he was informed exactly what role he was playing. Instead of going out and looking for this food, Juan Jr. was the food. Vargas and his gang cornered Juan Jr., beat him to death, butchered his body, and then literally fed him to the inmates. After hearing this horrific story, Carlos was completely destroyed. He went public and had a big press conference to tell the world about what happened to his son, demanding that the authorities take action. But despite there being many eyewitness accounts, ultimately the Venezuelan government denied the cannibalism and nobody was ever held accountable. Doranhel Vargas remains incarcerated and has never been charged with any crimes connected to Juan Jr.'s disappearance. At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raymundo Marfa Dilva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raymundo lived in the shack with his father, Revelino, as well as his two younger brothers who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room only a few feet away. Raymundo and his family were very poor. The shack was very small, composed of only 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and the kitchen, which was connected by a single wooden door. They were truly out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money, and they really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raymundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, his father, Revelino, came into the room from the kitchen. He sat down next to him, and the two just sat there quietly, enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers who were breathing softly in their sleep. As they were sitting there, suddenly Raymundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. He turned his attention and looked into the dark kitchen, and he saw a dark figure on all 4s quickly maneuvering across the ground out of sight. Raymundo was terrified. He turned to his dad, who was also staring at the kitchen door, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. Before Raymundo could do anything, his dad jumped up, slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. At that point, the 2 younger brothers woke up, and all 4 of them were looking at each other, wondering what was going on. Raymundo asked his dad what that was. Revelino was very unsettled. They did not have pets, and there were no other people inside of their shack. Revelino told his boys, "It is okay, I do not know what that is, but let us just stay here. We are safe. The door is locked, and we are all together." For a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Revelino and his sons began to hear voices. And they were coming from outside the shack. At first, they could not really tell what these voices were saying, but eventually they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there was talking about Revelino. They could hear his name, and what they were saying is that if Revelino came out there, they were going to kill him. The boys were terrified and asked their dad what they should do. Revelino told his boys, "It is okay, I do not know what is going on, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This has to be a prank." He told his sons that they were just going to stay put in this room where they were safe, wait until the sun comes up, and then figure out who was playing this prank on them. Sure enough, Revelino and his sons stayed in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m., when the sun began to come up. At that point, Revelino told his sons to stay put, and he was going to go out there and investigate. By this point, they had stopped hearing voices, and it felt like whoever was out there had passed. Revelino walked over to the door that led into the kitchen, unlocked it, opened it up, and looked inside. He told the boys to stay there, and then he went out into the kitchen and shut the door behind him. While he was out there, the boys listened anxiously, but they just heard the sound of their dad walking around the kitchen. There was no commotion. A couple of minutes later, Revelino came back into the main room. He had a knife in his hand, but he told them, "It is okay, there is nothing out here. I am now going to go outside and make sure nobody is outside the hut. Stay put, I will be right back." Revelino walked out again into the kitchen, shut the door behind him, and the boys heard the sound of the back door opening. Presumably, Revelino went outside, and that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from the shack. At some point, they came across a huge boulder. This boulder had a big crevice in it, and one of the hunters happened to walk past and look inside. There, they found a skeleton. That skeleton belonged to Revelino, Raymundo's father. But that was not the end of the story. On the day that Revelino stepped out the front door and was never heard from again, Raymundo felt really nervous. He defied his father, opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and looked towards the outside door. It was wide open. He saw his dad stepping into a huge cloud of yellow smoke. Amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, and seemingly spitting out the smoke. Raymundo had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad walking into this cloud. The smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad, who disappeared. Raymundo yelled out for his dad and charged towards him to try to stop him, but as soon as Raymundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated. The cylinders disappeared, and his dad was gone too. Raymundo sprinted around, calling for his dad, but there was no sign of him. They alerted authorities, who launched a search, but they could not find him. And then, 6 months later, his body was found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Revelino, how he wound up inside of that rock crevice, what that dark figure in the kitchen was, or what those floating cylinders were. It remains a mystery. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close and had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents went through a really messy divorce. During it, their father walked out on them, and they never saw him again. Shortly after that, their mother remarried, and her new husband moved in with the family. And shortly after that, their mother just vanished. The boys asked their stepfather where she was, but he would say, "I do not know, she went out on an errand and she never came back." The boys were very suspicious, because this did not feel like something their mom would do. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. Suddenly, these teenage boys were left to fend for themselves. They contacted the police, explaining that they thought something happened to their mom and that their stepfather had something to do with it. The police launched an investigation, but they could not find their mother or their stepfather. After the police wound down their investigation, the two boys who had been orphaned learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City, but they could never get any closure. Today, the two brothers had met up not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. After they were abandoned, they had lived in the house on their own, grown up there, and eventually moved out to start their own adult lives, but they had never sold the house. Now, they were going back to clean it up and do some basic renovations. The two brothers met up at the home and went inside. Old photos were still on the wall, and memories came rushing back, many of which were very sad and troubling. They decided that since the place had been sitting there for years and had fallen into disrepair, they would fix it up. Over the next couple of days, they called in some contractors to begin doing some basic renovations while the brothers continued to clean up and pack things. On one particular day, a group of contractors was working in the master bedroom. The brothers were in the living room doing their own thing when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. The two brothers got up, bolted into the master suite, and looked at something sitting on the ground. At first, they did not even know what they were looking at. But then, the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was, and suddenly the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It turned out the brothers were right. Their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day she left and never came back, she had been bound, gagged, and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. We know this because when the contractor was doing renovations inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite. When he pulled it out, a white object came tumbling out. That object was their mother's skull. After pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they found the rest of her skeleton, clearly bound and gagged. Most disturbingly of all, they also found scratch marks inside the wall, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, desperately trying to get the attention of her sons, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the two brothers went to the police in Mexico City and told them what happened. The police came to the house and looked all over, trying to figure out who killed her, but they could not solve it. The police always suspected the stepfather, given that he went missing a couple of days after the mother did, but they could never locate him. Today, he would be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead. The brothers were left with a devastating sense of grief, knowing that their mother had been right there the whole time, trapped inside the walls of the home where they lived, while they spent years searching the streets of the city for her. It was a tragic end to a decades-long mystery. They had to deal with the realization that their lives had been completely altered by a monster who lived under the same roof. The trauma was immense, but it also brought them closer together as brothers, having survived such an unimaginable ordeal. They decided to finally tear down the house, unable to live with the physical structure that had held such a dark secret for so long, and instead built a beautiful memorial to honor their mother's life and ensure she was never forgotten. It was a way for them to reclaim their lives and find a sliver of peace. Now, as of right now, we have a brand new show, a history podcast. But wait, it is not like a boring history show. This is not like, when you were in school and you had to sit through lectures about something that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago. It is not that. We are going to pull from history, but we are going to tell the true stories behind moments in history. We are going to give you stories that feel like classic, suspenseful stories with plot twists and crazy points of view. It is going to be classic storytelling, but again, historical is the context. Here, let me give you an example. So, if you look back and try to identify the first time true crime sort of became a thing that the public was suddenly interested in, a case that really had nothing to do with them just because it was entertaining, that case would be about this murderer who escaped. And that is kind of all that is available if you look it up. Oh, yep, escaped murderer. That is when true crime became a thing. But did you know that that case, the escaped murderer, was way more compelling and exciting than most people give it credit for? People were interested at the time because there was this crazy transatlantic boat chase, and there was this crazy hunt for the killer, and the killing itself was so grisly. And that story really does not get told much. It is just kind of a statistic in a history book. And so what this podcast does is it finds cases like that and actually shows you why history is so cool and so interesting. And that is just episode 1. So this new history podcast is called A Twist of History, and it is live right now. So go to any platform where you get your podcasts and look up A Twist of History, or just search for Ballen Studios and you can find it that way.
follow the show and tune in each week. And if you really want to, give us a 5-star review. The show is totally free. New episodes every Wednesday. Oh, and one more thing. Be sure to stick around till the end of today's video for a sneak peek of episode 1. It was July 9th, 1910. A 16-year-old boy flies down 4 flights of stairs of a concrete office building and steps out onto Borough High Street on the south bank of the River Thames. The noise hits him immediately. People are rushing down the sidewalk, the road filled with a mix of horse-drawn buggies and rattling automobiles. The street is so crowded it overwhelms the boy. He quickly pulls his hat down further to partially cover his face and starts weaving his way through the foot traffic. He darts his eyes back and forth, convinced that someone is going to recognize him. He can feel his heartbeat all the way up in his ears. He keeps rushing and scanning the street, but nobody pays any attention to him. So, the boy finally relaxes a little. He slows down to a normal walk and makes his way to the entrance of a nearby London Underground station. A few minutes later, the boy sees his father coming towards him, holding a single small suitcase. The boy greets his father, and they run down the steps together into the underground just in time to catch the next train. The boy watches the train doors close and the mass of passengers exiting. He looks around to make sure he still has not been recognized and follows his father on board. As the train car continues to fill up, the boy and his dad lower their heads, avoiding eye contact with their fellow passengers. And finally, the train starts to roll down the underground tracks, and the boy and his father exhale. Their escape from England has begun. It was a quiet, tense moment, but they knew they had to keep moving. But let us talk about what made this case so famous. Back in 1910, there was no internet, no smartphones, and no television. The only way people got their news was through the newspapers that were printed several times a day. And when this particular murder was discovered, it completely captivated the public. The details of the crime were so shocking that they quickly became the talk of the entire city. People were buying every edition of the newspaper just to read the latest updates. The police were under immense pressure to find the killer, but the suspect had a massive head start. He had managed to slip away from London unnoticed, leaving the detectives completely baffled. They had no idea where he had gone, but they knew he had to be fleeing the country. This led to a frantic search of all the major ports in England, with officers checking every ship that was departing for foreign lands. But the suspect was clever. He had disguised himself and was traveling under an assumed name, making it incredibly difficult for the authorities to track his movements. The chase quickly expanded beyond the borders of England, turning into an international manhunt that captured the attention of people all over the world. As the days went by, the tension continued to mount. The police received countless tips from the public, but most of them led to dead ends. They were racing against the clock, knowing that with every passing hour, the suspect was getting further and further away. But then, a breakthrough occurred. A sharp-eyed witness reported seeing a man matching the suspect's description boarding a steamship bound for North America. This ship was already in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, completely cut off from the rest of the world, with no way for the police to reach it. Or so the killer thought. What the suspect did not realize was that this particular ship was equipped with a brand new technology that was about to change the world of crime detection forever. It was a wireless telegraph. The captain of the ship was able to send a message back to England, confirming that the suspect was indeed on board and was traveling with a companion who was disguised as his son. This news sent shockwaves through the police department, and they immediately put a plan into action. A team of Scotland Yard detectives boarded a faster, more modern steamship determined to overtake the suspect's ship before it reached its destination in Canada. It was a high-stakes, dramatic race across the ocean, with the entire world watching and waiting to see who would win. Every day, the newspapers published updates on the positions of the two ships, and the public followed the chase with bated breath. It was the first time in history that a manhunt was followed in real time by millions of people across the globe, creating a level of excitement and suspense that had never been seen before. It was a watershed moment that marked the birth of the public's obsession with true crime stories, setting the stage for the genre that continues to fascinate us today. And on our new podcast, A Twist of History, we are going to dive deep into all the incredible details of this legendary chase, exploring the brilliant detective work, the technological breakthroughs, and the final, dramatic confrontation that took place on the shores of Canada. We will show you the human side of this historic event, bringing the characters to life and making you feel like you are right there in the middle of the action. This is just one of the many mind-blowing stories we have in store for you, and we cannot wait for you to hear them all. So, if you are ready to experience history in a whole new way, go and check out A Twist of History right now. It is available on all your favorite podcast platforms, and new episodes will be released every Wednesday. Do not miss out on this incredible journey through the past. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.
There is a strange part of human nature that makes us want to go exactly where we are told not to go. When we see a high fence, a locked gate, or a warning sign that says keep out, something inside of us gets incredibly curious. We start to wonder, what is on the other side? Is it a beautiful view, a hidden secret, or something dangerous? For most of us, we look at the warning signs, we feel that little spark of curiosity, and then we turn around and walk away. We follow the rules because we know those rules are usually there to keep us safe. But some people cannot resist the temptation. They see the boundary as a challenge. They decide to step over the line, to push past the warnings, and to explore the forbidden zones. Today, we are going to look at 3 stories of people who did exactly that. They went into places that were completely off limits, and they ended up facing consequences that were far more terrifying than any warning sign could ever describe. Our first story takes us to the beautiful island of Oahu in Hawaii. It was February 27th, 2015. An 18-year-old native Hawaiian named Ballen was visiting his grandmother. Ballen was an energetic young man who loved the outdoors. Even though he was native to Hawaii, he had not spent a lot of time on Oahu, so this trip was a special occasion. He wanted to make the most of his time there, and there was one specific adventure that he had been dreaming about for years. He wanted to climb the famous haiku stairs, which are also known to locals as the Stairway to Heaven. Now, the Stairway to Heaven is not your typical hiking trail. It is a highly dangerous, extremely narrow, and completely illegal pathway that climbs up the side of a massive mountain. The trail consists of nearly 4,000 steel steps that are bolted directly into the steep cliffs. It was originally built during World War II by the United States Navy so they could gain access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and poorly maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987. They literally put up a fence and put guards out to keep people from going in, and they handed out massive fines to anyone caught trespassing, but Ballen really wanted to do this. That morning, he told his grandmother that he was thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. His grandmother immediately got worried. She told him that it was a horrible idea, explaining how dangerous the crumbling stairs were and warning him that he would be fined thousands of dollars if he got caught. Ballen backed down and told her that he would not go, playing it off like he had changed his mind. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal, he was so excited about the hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. The first photo he posted showed him standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the massive mountain towering above him. He added a caption about how excited he was to finally start the hike. Over the next few hours, Ballen climbed higher and higher into the clouds. He kept taking photos and posting them online for his friends and family to see. Each picture showed the stunning dramatic drops on either side of the narrow metal stairs. He looked happy, full of energy, and completely fine. And then he kept climbing, taking more pictures as the stairs became steeper and more treacherous. But then, right around 11 o'clock that morning, the posting stopped abruptly. He had not reached the summit yet. You figure if you are going to do this hike and you are already posting pictures of the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you are going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post those because that is the prize at the end. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly had not reached the summit yet. By that night, when he did not come home, his family was really concerned and they notified the police. The police launched a huge search for him, looking all over the stairs. They had helicopters out, and even the Navy got involved, but there was absolutely no sign of him. He had just vanished. When they could not find him after several days, they had to call the search off. The assumption was that he simply slipped at some point and fell down the mountain, which is exactly why the stairs are off limits and not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something chilling. One shot looked like he was just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down in the bushes a little ways down the trail who appears to be hiding. Many people believe that this man was following Ballen and at some point attacked him. They believe Ballen did not fall off the mountain, but was instead abducted or killed. To this day, Ballen has never been found, and that mystery man has never been identified. Now, let us travel to the most remote island in the world, which is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000-mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be absolutely nothing else inside of it. There is no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away, and that is Antarctica, which is not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that is 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs near it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anyone found out is because a United States satellite happened to be looking in its direction and saw 2 bright flashes of light. For the very few people who have ever gone to Bouvet Island, you cannot just take a ship there because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs and the water is treacherous. If you were to fall in, you would get sucked up underneath the rocks and you would be done for. So, nearly anyone who has stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter, which is a long, sketchy flight. Anyone who has been on the island only stays for a few minutes because they are worried about a storm rolling in, and the weather there is famously bad. Oh, and Bouvet Island is also an active volcano. It is a horrible place where nobody should go, but a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a flat shelf. The British wanted to build a weather station there, but they needed someone to go out and give the green light. On April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down, everybody was on edge because they were in the most remote place in the world. The team immediately got to work surveying the site, while Crawford decided to step over the ridge for just a couple of minutes to look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and wanted to get a better look at it. He walked up this embankment and crested the hill, and as he looked down, he saw a little rocky alcove where there was a bit of a beach. And sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon, he saw a wooden lifeboat that was half sunken. He could not believe it because he knew it was not theirs, and he was thinking how a boat could have gotten here at all when the nearest land was 1,100 miles away. He started walking down towards the beach and saw 2 wooden oars that went with the boat. Next to them was a flattened copper tank used to catch water, and next to that was a wooden barrel which would have been used to store water. He looked around for other signs of human life, but there were none. There was no tent, no clothes, and no human remains. He got down to the beach and waded into the water to inspect the lifeboat. He looked for identifying marks or numbers, but there were none. Because Crawford knew they had very little time, he ran back on shore, took a quick photo of the lifeboat with his camera, and then returned to his team. He told them what he had found, but his team was so focused on getting the survey done and getting out of there that they did not really care. They said it probably just washed up from some shipwreck and told him to forget about it. Crawford flew back to South Africa, showed the photo to his superiors, but they did not care either. 2 years later, another crew was sent to survey that same lagoon, but when they arrived, there was no boat, no barrel, no copper tank, and no oars. It was as if it was never there. We still do not know who was on that boat, how they got there, or where they went. In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It is this beautiful, crystal-clear water spring that people love to visit every summer when the weather gets hot in Texas. People converge on Jacob's Well to enjoy swimming in the refreshing water, but it is not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It is also for daredevils who strap scuba gear on and dive down through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 distinct chambers, and as you move from one chamber to the next, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces. Each of the chambers gets smaller and darker because you are losing sunlight, making them overall much more difficult to navigate. If you put on your scuba gear and hop into Jacob's Well, you swim straight down and reach the first chamber, which sits between 30 and 55 feet deep. In this first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there is algae and wildlife, and this is where rookie scuba divers spend their time. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it is much narrower, and this tunnel actually makes up the second chamber, bringing you down to 80 feet deep. Any diver in the second chamber has to be extremely aware of their surroundings on their ascent so they do not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is an opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber, but it is a complete dead end. It loops around before hitting a solid rock wall, forcing you to go all the way back out, assuming you have enough air. The second chamber attracts intermediate divers, but it is very tight and claustrophobic. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your air tanks on. This brings you into a small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there is loose silt and gravel on the floor. If your fin so much as knocks it, the silt will float into the water and completely blind you. Generally speaking, only expert divers ever go into this third chamber. At the bottom of this chamber is a heavy metal grate that sits over a tiny little opening, which is the entrance to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it actually looks like inside the fourth chamber, because once you go in, it is impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, meaning you are going in blind. Furthermore, anyone who has successfully entered the fourth chamber has died there. There are literally deceased divers inside of the fourth chamber, and after about a dozen people died trying to get in there, they finally sealed it up with that heavy grate. But to go in, you have to remove your air tanks, push them ahead of you through the hole, and then slowly wriggle your way in while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth. In 1983, 2 24-year-old college students named Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 in the evening. They were both highly experienced advanced scuba divers who had dived Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water, went through the first chamber, continued into the second chamber, wriggled into the third chamber, and reached the grate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open the heavy grate. Richard Patton was the first one to go in. He removed his tanks, pushed them inside the opening, and began headfirst to slither inside the fourth chamber. Clark waited outside in the third chamber. But as soon as Richard made it inside, things went terribly wrong. Clark would later state that as soon as Richard got into the chamber, he came screaming back out of the opening. Clark realized that Richard did not have his mouthpiece in and did not have his scuba tanks on. He had dropped his gear in the pitch blackness and was desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold. Richard was reaching for Clark to pull him through the hole. As soon as Richard got free, Clark took his own mouthpiece off and jammed it into Richard's mouth. They began buddy breathing, sharing the single regulator back and forth as they made their way back up, leaving the lost equipment behind. They made it back into the third chamber and then into the second chamber, kicking desperately to reach the surface. But in their panic, their heads suddenly hit solid rock, and they realized they had gone up the false chimney. What was even worse was that they heard the empty hiss of their tank, meaning they were completely out of air. Clark, who had taken a full breath before the air ran out, turned and managed to swim out of the false chimney and make it to the surface before drowning. But Richard was not as lucky. His final moments were spent in total darkness, with the silt kicked up all around him with no air and no idea where to go. He desperately tried to swim up, but kept hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. When we look back at these three cases, we are left with a profound sense of mystery and a deep appreciation for the boundaries that exist in our world. It is easy to look at warning signs, fences, and closed gates as mere inconveniences designed to restrict our freedom, but the reality is much more sobering. These boundaries are often written in the history of tragic lessons learned by those who came before us. The lure of the forbidden is a powerful force in human psychology, drawing us toward the edges of the map and the depths of the unknown, but nature is completely indifferent to our curiosity. In the case of Ballen, an ordinary trip to visit his grandmother turned into a parent's worst nightmare, leaving a family with a permanent void and a haunting question that may never be answered. Was Ballen simply a victim of the treacherous, crumbling steps of the Haiku stairs, or did he cross paths with a predator who was using the illegal trail as a hunting ground? The image of the crouched figure in the bushes remains a chilling reminder that when we step off the beaten path, we leave behind the safety of society and enter a world where we are completely vulnerable. On Bouvet Island, the mystery of the abandoned lifeboat challenges our understanding of human survival. Who were the people who rowed a simple wooden boat across thousands of miles of the most hostile ocean on Earth, only to land on a freezing volcanic rock? How did they manage to survive, and where did they go when the boat vanished? The complete lack of human remains or personal belongings on that icy beach suggests a story of quiet desperation, a struggle against the elements that was ultimately swallowed by the freezing wind and snow, leaving behind only a single photograph as proof that they were ever there. And at Jacob's Well, the tragic fate of Richard Patton shows us how quickly an exciting adventure can turn into a deadly trap. The false chimney stands as a physical manifestation of our worst fears, an illusion that promises safety but delivers only darkness and confinement. For the survivors, the guilt and the memories of those final desperate moments under the water are a heavy burden to carry, a constant reminder of how a single wrong turn in the dark can make the difference between life and death. Ultimately, these stories remind us to respect the limits of our own endurance and the rules that protect us, because once we step across that line into the forbidden, we are entirely on our own, and the earth does not always let us return. It makes you realize that sometimes the signs are there for a reason, and some secrets are simply meant to stay buried in the quiet, dark places where humans were never meant to go. And the scariest part is every single one of these people thought they would make it back. If you're not ready to sleep yet, there are more true mysteries waiting in the next video.
On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neri Morgan was walking with his two younger brothers through a remote and dusty desert in South Australia. This vast, barren area was called Maralinga. Neri and his brothers belonged to an isolated Aboriginal tribe known as the Martu people. On this particular day, the boys were out doing what their people had done for generations. They were hunting for food to bring back to their family. Specifically, they were tracking kangaroos. Neri, being the oldest, carried a hunting spear, while his two younger brothers carried a wooden club and a traditional boomerang. For hours, they had been quietly following a specific group of kangaroos across the dry terrain. But every single time the boys got close, just as they would slow down and prepare to strike, the kangaroos would suddenly sense them and bolt away. It was incredibly frustrating, and the afternoon sun was starting to beat down on them. But they kept going because their family was relying on them for dinner. Eventually, as they continued their long trek, the kangaroos stopped. They had gathered around a small watering hole just a few dozen yards away from where the brothers were hiding. Neri looked at his brothers and knew this was their absolute best chance. The kangaroos were thirsty, and they were going to stay at that watering hole long enough for the boys to make their move. Neri quietly signaled to his younger brothers that it was time to advance. They dropped low into the dry brush, moving as silently as possible, inching closer and closer to their targets. But after taking only a few cautious steps, a strange and terrifying sound shattered the quiet of the desert. It started as a low, deep, rumbling noise vibrating through the ground from somewhere off in the distance. The brothers stopped in their tracks. Before they could even understand what was happening, the entire sky suddenly lit up. It was an impossibly bright, blinding white light, so intense that Neri had to quickly shield his eyes with his arms just to keep from being blinded. And as he was doing this, a massive, incredibly hot gust of wind came roaring through the desert. This was not a normal desert breeze. It was a violent shockwave that blasted right into them, literally lifting the brothers off their feet and slamming them hard onto the dirt. They lay there, completely disoriented, with their ears ringing and their skin burning from the sudden heat. From the ground, Neri struggled to turn his head to see what had happened to his brothers and the environment around them. He looked over in the direction of the watering hole where the kangaroos had been just moments before. And what he saw next made absolutely no sense to him. The kangaroos were literally floating high up in the air, drifting right toward them through the hazy sky, and then they suddenly dropped heavily onto the ground. A moment later, it was as if a switch had been flipped. Everything just went back to normal. The blinding white light faded, and the sky returned to its usual blue color. The deep rumbling stopped, and the hot wind died down completely. The desert was quiet once again. Except now, right in front of Neri and his brothers, lay a dozen dead kangaroos. The boys stood up, dusted the dirt off their clothes, and tried to process what they had just witnessed. They had absolutely no concept of modern technology or what could cause such a massive explosion. To them, living their isolated life, there was only one logical explanation. They looked at this incredible bounty of fresh meat lying right at their feet, and they decided this must have been a gift from God. They believed that God had literally reached down, taken the lives of these kangaroos, lifted them up, and delivered them directly to the brothers so their tribe wouldn't go hungry. Filled with gratitude, Neri and his brothers began lifting the heavy animals, carrying as many of the dead kangaroos as they possibly could manage back to their camp. When they arrived and told their people what had happened, the tribe was overjoyed. That very night, they held a massive celebration to honor this miraculous gift from God. They built a large fire, roasted the kangaroo meat, and held a giant feast. Almost everyone in the tribe ate the meat, celebrating their good fortune. But the very next morning, the celebration turned into a nightmare. When the tribe woke up, nearly everyone who had eaten the kangaroo meat was violently ill. People were vomiting uncontrollably, their bodies were covered in painful red rashes, and they were suffering from intense aches and deep internal pain. Over the next few days, some of the tribe members slowly began to recover, but many others only got worse. Soon, people from the tribe began to die, one after the other. Neri and the surviving members of the tribe immediately made the connection. They realized that whatever was killing their people was directly tied to the kangaroo meat they had eaten. Some members of the tribe who had been skeptical about the gift from God theory argued that the meat must have been poisoned. But they had no idea how it had been poisoned, or if someone had done it on purpose. For Neri and his people, this tragic event remained an unsolved mystery for over a decade. Fast forward to 11 years later, in 1967, when Neri was 24 years old. That was when representatives from the British government finally arrived in the remote areas of southern Australia near where the Martu tribe lived. It turned out these officials were there to try and clean up a massive, dangerous mess they had created years earlier. And that was when the horrifying truth was finally revealed. Those dead kangaroos that had seemingly floated through the air and dropped at the feet of Neri and his brothers were not a gift from God at all. Instead, they were the victims of a highly classified, top-secret scientific experiment. The British government had been using the Maralinga Desert to test active nuclear weapons. On that afternoon in 1956, Neri and his brothers had been standing just a few kilometers away from an active nuclear detonation site. Where they were positioned was the absolute perfect spot to experience the fringe effects of a nuclear blast. They saw the blinding flash of the detonation, they heard the deafening roar of the shockwave, and they felt the intense thermal radiation that knocked them to the ground. But because they were just far enough away, the blast wave did not kill them. It only disoriented and bruised them. However, the kangaroos at the watering hole were positioned slightly closer to the epicenter of the bomb. Because the kangaroos were closer, and because they were much smaller animals, they were completely vulnerable to the full force of the pressure wave. The shock wave had killed the kangaroos instantly, lifted them into the air, and thrown their bodies forward, landing them right in front of the boys. But the worst part was that the blast had coated the animal carcasses in highly concentrated, invisible radioactive fallout. When the tribe cooked and ate the meat, they were ingesting lethal amounts of radiation. This caused severe acute radiation sickness, which explained the sudden vomiting, the skin rashes, and the agonizing deaths. The British government kept these tests secret for years, and an unknown number of indigenous people lost their lives due to the radioactive contamination. Eventually, after the truth came out, the Australian government ended up paying $13.5 million in compensation to the Aboriginal tribes that were devastated by the nuclear tests. Neri Morgan survived the ordeal, and today he is in his 80s, still sharing this incredible and tragic story with younger generations so that the history of his people is never forgotten. Now, let's move to another afternoon, this one in the fall of 2019, in a quiet neighborhood in Knoxville, Iowa. It was around 4 in the afternoon on Saturday, October 26th, and 56-year-old Pamela Kramer was enjoying a beautiful day in her son's backyard. Pamela was a warm, family-oriented woman who worked during the week as an assistant at a nearby United States Army base. But her job was just a way to pay the bills. Her true passion in life was her family. She lived for her husband, for children, and her grandchildren. On this particular Saturday, the family had gathered in the backyard for a very special occasion. They were holding a gender reveal party for Pamela's son and his pregnant wife, who were expecting a new baby. Pamela was absolutely thrilled and could not wait to find out if she was going to have a new grandson or granddaughter. After everyone had chatted and enjoyed some food, Pamela's son announced to the guests that it was finally time for the big reveal. The guests, including Pamela and several other close relatives, got excited and backed up toward the safety of the wooden fence on the side of the yard to get a good view. Pamela pulled out her mobile phone and began recording a video. She wanted to capture every single second of this beautiful moment so she could look back on it for years to come. In the center of the yard, the family had set up a homemade device that was supposed to shoot a cloud of colored powder into the air. Blue powder would mean it was a boy, and pink would mean it was a girl. Pamela's son walked out to the middle of the lawn and leaned over the device. He turned back to the crowd, smiled, and asked if everyone was ready. Pamela gave him a big thumbs up, keeping her phone pointed directly at him. Her son then bent down and lit a fuse attached to the device. He quickly backed away, running over to stand next to his pregnant wife along the fence line with the rest of the family. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the colorful cloud to appear. But instead of a beautiful puff of colored powder, a deafening metallic explosion shattered the air. In an instant, the peaceful backyard turned into a war zone. The homemade device was not just a harmless powder launcher. The family had built the device using a thick metal cylinder which they had packed tightly with gunpowder and the colored dust, sealing the top and bottom. When the son lit the fuse, he had unknowingly created a highly volatile pipe bomb. The immense pressure of the burning gunpowder could not escape the metal pipe safely, causing the steel cylinder to rupture and violently explode. Sharp, jagged metal shrapnel was blasted in every direction at incredible speeds, flying up to 400 feet away. Some pieces of metal tore through the wooden fences of neighboring homes, while others lodged themselves into the walls of the house. Tragically, one large piece of the exploding metal flew directly toward the fence line where the family was standing. It struck Pamela directly in the head, knocking her to the ground. The backyard erupted into total chaos as family members screamed in terror and rushed to call emergency services. When the first responders arrived, they found a devastating scene. Metal debris was scattered everywhere, and Pamela was lying near the fence, having died instantly from her injuries. It was a heartbreaking tragedy that shocked the local community. Miraculously, despite the heavy shrapnel flying all over the yard and through the neighborhood, no one else was injured. Because the incident was determined to be a tragic and unintentional accident, the local authorities decided not to file any criminal charges against the family. Now, let's fast forward to another clear morning on October 30th, 2014, in Wichita, Kansas. A 54-year-old Russian pilot named Sergei Galitsky walked into the Flight Safety International building located at the Wichita National Airport. Sergei was accompanied by his personal translator. Sergei was a highly experienced pilot who had spent over 30 years flying commercial jets and helicopters back in Russia. But on this day, he was in Kansas to obtain a specific certification to fly a Cessna turboprop plane. Because he did not speak fluent English, he brought his translator along to help him communicate with the flight instructors and understand the technical training. Inside the lobby, the translator explained to the front desk clerk that Sergei was there for his scheduled training session. The clerk smiled, nodded, and went to the back of the building to locate Sergei's designated instructor. A few moments later, the clerk returned with 78-year-old Jay Ferguson. Jay was a legendary flight instructor with decades of aviation experience, known for his thoroughness and deep knowledge of aircraft. After shaking hands and greeting each other, Jay led Sergei and the translator through the security doors and deep into the state-of-the-art training facility. As they walked down the hallways, they passed several large high-tech rooms filled with millions of dollars worth of advanced aviation equipment. Eventually, Jay stopped the group in front of a massive white spherical pod that sat mounted on top of a complex hydraulic base. To an ordinary person, it looked like a high-tech simulator ride you might find at an amusement park. But to Sergei, he knew what this was. This was a professional-level flight simulator designed to perfectly mimic the flight dynamics, cockpit layout, and emergency scenarios of a real Cessna aircraft. Even though Sergei had thousands of hours of real flight experience, the Aviation Authority required him to complete several simulated flights in this exact pod to prove his competency before they would allow him to pilot a real Cessna. Jay opened the heavy door to the simulator pod and gestured for the men to climb inside. Sergei climbed in first and sat down in the captain's seat on the left. Jay took the co-pilot's seat on his right, and the translator sat directly behind them so he could whisper instructions into Sergei's ear. Looking out the windows of the pod, Sergei was amazed by how realistic the simulation was. High-definition screens projected a perfect, three-dimensional view of the actual runway at the Wichita National Airport. It felt exactly as if they were sitting on the tarmac, ready for takeoff. Together, Jay and Sergei began going through the rigorous pre-flight safety checklists, verifying the virtual instruments, testing the flight controls, and ensuring the radio communications were working perfectly. Once everything was verified, Jay pressed a control panel button to start the simulation. Instantly, the hydraulic base beneath the pod activated, and the entire cabin began to rumble and vibrate, perfectly mimicking the sound and feel of a powerful propeller engine roaring to life. Jay gave Sergey the signal to begin. Sergey released the parking brake, grabbed the control yoke, and pushed the throttles forward. The simulator tilted slightly backward, giving the men the physical sensation of accelerating down the runway. As they gained speed, Sergey pulled back on the yoke, and the digital scenery tilted down as they climbed high into the simulated sky. For the next several minutes, Sergey practiced maneuvering the aircraft through the virtual airspace, performing turns, climbs, and descents. The flight simulator's advanced hydraulics moved the pod in perfect synchronization with Sergey's inputs, making the flight feel incredibly lifelike. Jay watched closely, occasionally speaking into his headset, with the translator quickly relaying the instructions to Sergey in Russian. Sergey adjusted quickly to the Cessna's sensitive controls, and Jay was highly impressed by the Russian pilot's smooth handling of the aircraft. It was clear that Sergey was going to easily pass his certification test. After completing all the required maneuvers, Jay decided it was time to bring the session to a close and have Sergey perform a landing back at the airport. Sergey turned the simulated plane around, lined it up with the virtual runway, and began his final descent. He carefully managed his speed and altitude, bringing the plane down smoothly toward the asphalt. Everything was going perfectly. Sergey brought the nose up slightly, preparing for a soft landing. But the exact microsecond the virtual tires of the simulator touched down on the digital runway, a massive, deafening crash shattered the silence of the room, and everything instantly went black. At that very same moment, people standing outside on the tarmac and near the airport buildings heard a terrifying, thunderous explosion. They spun around and saw a thick, black column of smoke and giant flames shooting out from the roof of the Flight Safety International building. Bystanders immediately called 911 as sirens began to wail across the airport. When the firefighters and emergency crews arrived on the scene, they were shocked by the scale of the destruction. Part of the building's roof and walls had been completely pulverized, and a raging fire was consuming the interior. It would turn out that while Sergey, Jay, and the translator were inside the dark simulator pod, another pilot named Mark Goldstein was taking off from the very same airport in a real twin-engine passenger plane. Shortly after takeoff, Mark's real plane suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, causing him to lose complete control of the aircraft. The plane veered wildly off course, plunged toward the ground, and crashed directly through the roof of the Flight Safety International building. By an almost impossible and tragic coincidence, the crashing plane struck the exact room and the exact simulator pod where Sergey and his team were conducting their training. The violent impact and the subsequent fuel explosion instantly killed the pilot of the real plane, Mark, as well as Jay, Sergey, and his translator inside the simulator. It was a bizarre and tragic event that sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In February of 1999, 3 women set out on what was supposed to be a fun road trip through California. They planned to visit Yosemite National Park, spend time together, and continue on to Arizona for a family vacation. But before the trip was over, all 3 of them would vanish. And months later, investigators would uncover one of the most horrifying murder cases in Yosemite's history, a case involving a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. On the 12th of February, 1999, a 42-year-old woman named Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend, 16-year-old Silvina Palazzo, boarded a plane in their hometown of Eureka, California. They were all excited for the trip ahead. After a quick 1-hour flight, their plane touched down in San Francisco. They made their way through the bustling airport, collected their bags from baggage claim, and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. At the counter, Carol handled all the paperwork. She signed the rental agreement, showed her license, and was handed a set of car keys. The three of them then headed out into the sprawling parking lot where they located their rental car, a shiny red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After loading their luggage into the trunk, they climbed inside. Carol got behind the wheel, while Julie and Silvina settled in for the ride. Then, Carol started the engine and began driving east towards Stockton, California, and specifically the University of the Pacific. The main reason for this part of the trip was for Julie. She was a dedicated cheerleader and was scheduled to compete in a big competition the very next day held at that university. But it was more than just a competition for her. Julie was seriously considering attending that school after she graduated from high school, so this was a perfect opportunity for her and her mom to get a real feel for the campus and the surrounding area. And since Silvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, it just made sense for her to tag along for the adventure. It was a trip filled with promise and excitement for the future. After about an hour and a half on the road, the trio arrived in Stockton. They found their hotel, checked in, and got settled for the night. The next day, February 13th, was the big day for Julie. She competed in her cheerleading event, and afterwards, she, her mom, and Silvina spent the rest of the day exploring the university. They walked through the grounds, checked out the different buildings, and got a sense of what life would be like there. They explored the town of Stockton as well, just enjoying their time together. Early the next morning, on Valentine's Day, February 14th, the three women checked out of their hotel in Stockton. They got back in their red Pontiac and started a 3-hour drive southeast. Their destination was a sprawling motel complex called the Cedar Lodge, which was located just outside the western entrance of Yosemite National Park. Their plan was to spend the next couple of days sightseeing inside the magnificent park. They wanted to see the giant sequoias, the towering cliffs, and all the natural beauty Yosemite had to offer. After their Yosemite adventure, they were scheduled to drive back to the San Francisco airport. There, they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jen Sund. The four of them would then continue their family vacation together, flying to Arizona to explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka. So, around midday on the 14th, the red Pontiac pulled into the parking lot of the Cedar Lodge. Because it was the middle of winter, the tourist season was slow and the lot was nearly empty. They parked the car and went into the front office to check in. They got their room keys and then walked from the office along a row of first-floor rooms. Their room was at the very end of the building, a corner unit, room 509. Carol used the key, opened the door, and they all went inside, dropping their luggage on the floor. After the long drive, they all felt pretty tired. They decided that they were too exhausted to try and go sightseeing in the park that day. So instead, they opted for a low-key afternoon and evening, mostly just relaxing in their hotel room, unwinding, and getting ready for their big day in the park tomorrow. The next morning, February 15th, they woke up early, full of energy. They hopped back into their red rental car and drove the short distance to the western entrance of Yosemite. They entered the park, found a place to park their car, and began their day of exploration. It was a truly wonderful day. They were in awe of the astonishing cliffsides, the snow-covered mountains, and the massive ancient sequoia trees that towered over them. They walked through beautiful meadows that seemed to stretch out forever. Towards the end of the day, as the afternoon light began to fade, Julie and Silvina even went ice skating on a frozen pond. It was a perfect, almost magical day spent together in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Finally, as the sun started to go down, casting long shadows across the valley, the trio decided to call it a day. They left the park, got back into their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. For dinner, they ate at the lodge's own 1950s-style diner. They ordered hamburgers and talked about their incredible day. After dinner, they swung by the front desk and rented a couple of VHS movie tapes to watch back in their room. Once they were back inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas. They all piled onto the beds and watched one of the movies they had rented. When it was over, they brushed their teeth, got into their beds, turned out the lights, and tried to go to sleep. But just a few minutes after the room went dark, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, February 16th, Jen Sund was waiting anxiously at the San Francisco airport. He was there to meet his wife, Carol, his daughter, Julie, and her friend, Sylvina. He kept looking at his watch, the minutes ticking by. He knew their flight to Arizona was scheduled to take off soon, and they didn't have much time to spare. He scanned the crowds, hoping to see them come running around a corner at any moment so they could all make a dash for the gate and just barely make their flight. But they didn't appear. Time kept passing, and there was still no sign of them. Finally, the final boarding call was announced. Jens, who didn't have a cell phone, and neither did Carol, had to make a decision. He began to think that there must have been some kind of miscommunication. Maybe they got their wires crossed, and Carol and the girls had taken an earlier flight and were already on their way to Arizona. It seemed like the only logical explanation. So, at the very last minute, he decided to board the flight by himself. He flew to Arizona, holding on to the hope that his family would be there waiting for him when he landed. But when his plane touched down in Arizona, his family was not there. He rushed to their hotel, his heart pounding, hoping maybe they had gone there directly. But they weren't there either. He spoke to the person at the hotel's front desk, asking if his wife Carol had contacted them or checked in. The clerk said no, they hadn't heard from her, and they had no record of her being there at all. At this point, Jens was obviously very upset and deeply worried. He spent the rest of the day on the phone, calling around to friends, family members, and anyone he could think of who might know where Carol and the girls could be. But no one had heard from them. No one knew where they were. That night, as Jens prepared to go to bed alone in his hotel room, he tried to convince himself that everything was probably fine. He told himself this was just some kind of screw-up, a mix-up in their plans. He knew Carol was an unbelievably fierce and competent woman. She would take care of the girls no matter what. He was sure he would see them or hear from them by tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning, there was still no word. Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or tried to reach him in any way. There was just no sign of her or the girls. The hope he had been clinging to faded away, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. Jens finally contacted the police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens and got all the details, the very first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge. It was the last known place that Carol, Julie, and Sylvina had been. The manager of the lodge told the police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But, he explained, this wasn't necessarily unusual. Carol had paid in advance when she checked in, so she wouldn't have needed to stop by the front desk on her way out. So, that detail wasn't an anomaly. The manager also told the police that on the 16th, after the checkout time had passed, the cleaning staff had gone to room 509. When they went inside, the room was vacant. Nothing seemed out of place or amiss. It was relatively clean, except for some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk, just as they were supposed to be. To the cleaners, it simply looked like the women had packed up and left that morning. So the next step for the police was to reach out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport. They needed to know if Carol had made it back to the airport and dropped off the red Pontiac. But when they spoke to the manager of the rental company, the news wasn't good. The manager confirmed that no, Carol had not dropped off her car. And she hadn't called to ask about extending her rental agreement, which was now officially overdue. Based on the information they gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, the police began to operate on a few working theories. The most likely scenario, they thought, was that the three women had left their motel room on the morning of the 16th and had gotten into a car accident somewhere on the winding mountain roads. Maybe their car had gone off an embankment and just hadn't been found yet. Another possibility was that they had driven somewhere, perhaps back into Yosemite National Park or to another trail, gotten out of their car to go for a walk, and had gotten lost. Or, and this was the least likely theory at the time, they had fallen victim to some kind of crime. At this early stage, the police were not seriously considering the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched. Search teams scoured the roads and trails in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as the areas around the western entrance to Yosemite. But they found absolutely nothing. Not a single trace of the women or their car. A number of workers from the Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police as a matter of routine, and they were all subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Police also spoke with a number of friends and family members of the three missing women, and they too were cleared. Then, a few days after the search began, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards still inside, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California. Modesto was a city located about 2 hours west of the Cedar Lodge. Some high school students had spotted it on the ground and turned it over to a police officer. This discovery was a game changer. There was no logical reason for Carol and the girls to have been in Modesto. It wasn't on their route back to San Francisco, nor was it near any tourist destinations they had planned to visit. This signaled to the police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And if that was the case, then it was almost certain that these three women had fallen victim to a crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued their search. They expanded their efforts, looking along all the roads and trails between the Cedar Lodge and Modesto. They searched all over the area where the wallet was found. But besides that one wallet, there were no further developments in the case. The trail went cold. Then, on March 18th, about a month after the three women had originally gone missing, a hiker was exploring a remote forest. He was about 2 hours north of the Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto. He was way off the beaten path when he turned onto a rarely used logging road. As he was walking down this road, he saw something up ahead. It was the skeleton of a car. It looked like the vehicle had been completely destroyed by a fire. He called it in to the police. When the police arrived, they weren't sure what they were looking at first. But they were eventually able to identify the vehicle. The charred metal shell was what remained of the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. They began to carefully search the vehicle. Inside the main cabin of the car, there was almost nothing left. It looked like there were some remnants of suitcases and maybe some burned clothing, but for the most part, it was just the metal frame of the car and the seat springs. But when they opened the trunk, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies. Their hands were still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, forensics was able to confirm that the bodies belonged to Carol Sund and Silvina Palazzo. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie. The 15-year-old was not in the car or anywhere in the surrounding area. This created a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Julie was still alive somewhere. Maybe if law enforcement acted fast enough, they could find her and save her before it was too late. But that hope was lost just a couple of days into the search around the car site. They still hadn't found any sign of Julie when the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. On the letter was a crude hand-drawn map. It showed a very specific spot overlooking a lake. The lake was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the burned car was found. And on the note, along with the map, was a single chilling phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using the crude map, police went to Don Pedro Lake. They found the overlook that was marked on the map, and from there, they looked down the steep hillside. And that's when they saw it. They found the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie Sund. At this point, the police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California. They believed these individuals were connected in some way to what had happened to the three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest. They were half-brothers, Eugene Dykes and Michael Larwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer, for several drug charges, and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks. He basically insinuated that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to the three women. And then, after the bodies of Carol, Silvina, and Julie were found, the investigation seemed to find more evidence pointing their way. Synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol's body matched synthetic fibers that were pulled from the clothing and vehicle of Michael and Eugene when they were arrested. So, the police were very confident that they had their killers, and that they already had them behind bars. But they still needed to compile more evidence before they could formally charge them with the murders and make their names public. So when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began to panic about a killer or killers being on the loose, the police held a press conference. They told everyone to calm down. They said, "We have the people responsible, we just can't tell you who they are yet." They asked the public to be patient while they built their case, but they assured everyone that they were safe and there was nothing to worry about. But 4 months went by, and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders. They continued to insist to the public that they had their killers behind bars and that nobody had anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the 3 bodies, a man named Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 2-4-hour shift at the park's clinic. He had just gotten back to his cabin, which was located inside Yosemite, when his pager went off. He went to a phone, dialed the number on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up. The dispatcher said, "Hey, Doctor. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person? Doctor." Kidd said, "Sure, he'd love to help." Then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, "Hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one." And then, before Dr. Kidd could ask what he meant, the dispatcher hung up the phone. Doctor. Kidd was really confused by that last comment. In the 3 years he had worked at the park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people. But they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always cases of hikers getting lost or falling and injuring themselves, which was a fairly common occurrence inside a park as vast as Yosemite. So as soon as a convoy of other Yosemite staff members, who were also part of the search team, rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside. He hopped into one of the vehicles and asked the driver, "What's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with this missing person?" The driver explained to him what was happening. He said, "Hey, you know how 4 months ago we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina? And they were found murdered outside of the park?" He continued, "Well, even though the police have been saying they have their killers behind bars, they still haven't actually named who their killers are or charged anyone with their murders. And that's made a lot of us think that maybe they don't have the killer. Maybe there's a killer still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight, we have another person who's gone missing inside the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led a lot of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight." Doctor. Kidd was totally shocked by this news. But he was even more shocked when he found out who it was that was missing. It was someone he knew. Her name was Joy Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide, someone who knows everything about the park's flora and fauna. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy sped through the park. They turned down an unmarked road with huge trees on either side. Eventually, they came out of this heavily forested road and entered into an unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end of this huge meadow, there was a single green cabin sitting at the base of a mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joy was living. As Dr. Kidd and the convoy drove across the meadow and got closer to the cabin, he could see park rangers walking around the perimeter, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Dr. Kidd's vehicle came to a stop right outside the taped-off area, they all got out. They could see a white pickup truck parked right next to the cabin. It was Joie's truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage. It looked like some of the luggage had spilled out onto the ground, and some of the truck's doors were still open. It gave Dr. Kidd and the other searchers the impression that Joie must have been either loading things into her truck or unloading things from her truck at the exact moment she went missing. Dr. Kidd and the other searchers huddled up with the park rangers. The rangers explained that Joie's friends, who lived in San Francisco, had been expecting Joie to arrive at their house the day before. But when she never showed up, and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called the park authorities to report her missing. That's why they were all there now, looking for her. After discussing the circumstances of the case, they all decided to break into 5 different search groups and begin searching the immediate area around the cabin. Dr. Kid and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin, towards the tree line. Once they got into the forest, they started walking towards a nearby creek. As they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and broken saplings. It looked like someone had come running through there in a panic. Perhaps the person who was running was Joie. So they began following these tracks which ran right alongside the creek. Then, at some point, one of the searchers yelled out, "Hey, what's that up there?" About 10 feet ahead of them, the ground sloped down into a ditch, out of their direct line of sight. But right before the ditch, hanging on a small tree branch near the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. Dr. Kid, who was at the front of his small search party, began walking towards the keys. As he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into the ditch that was just on the other side of the keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom of that ditch, he immediately began to gag. He turned around and quickly walked away, unable to process what he had just seen. The other 4 searchers walked up, and they too had a look down into the ditch. They all had a similar horrified reaction. Before long, the whole group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police. The police then sent an officer to Joie Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and that she needed to call them. He then handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joie's mother was immediately concerned and confused. She tried to get more information from the officer, but he just said, "Look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything." So eventually she thanked him, shut the door, and went into her kitchen to make the call. She dialed the number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joie's mother. At that point, the person who had answered quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior. This new person asked Joie's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" Joie's mother said no, she was not aware of that. And then this person very delicately said, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joie's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her? Because she's got bright red hair. Can you make sure it's really her?" The person on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." After this strange and terrifying call finally ended, Joie's mother was completely confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? It seemed like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? She was horribly distraught and didn't know what else to do. She was told to just wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. So she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to see for herself what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. She spent a very restless night, barely sleeping, just praying that the person they had found was not actually her daughter. The next morning, she got up, rushed to the airport, and as she was waiting to board her plane, she grabbed a newspaper from a nearby kiosk. The headline on the front page read, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite," and that's when she understood. That's when she knew why the person on the phone could not tell her whether or not the body was her daughter based on hair color. It was because the body they had found did not have a head. In the time between her getting that phone call and this headline running in the paper, the searchers had found the head. It was located about 27 feet away from the body, hidden under some brush. And they were able to confirm that it was in fact the body of Joie Armstrong. Joie's death was immediately treated as a homicide. And right away, the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joie's murder was connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina from 4 months earlier. This was despite the fact that the police were still saying, "We have our killers for those murders behind bars." Joa's murder is completely unconnected. Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right, because there was a break in Joe's case almost immediately. On the night that Joe went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin. They noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout. As it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in all of Yosemite Valley. So, within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite, pulled off to the side of a highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up to the vehicle. There was no one inside. But then they noticed a path leading down an embankment off the highway, which led down to a forest where there was a river that people liked to swim and fish in. So, the 2 officers decided to head down there and see if maybe the driver was down by the river. They made their way down the path, and sure enough, they came in contact with the driver. He was lying on a rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. The 2 officers approached him and introduced themselves. The man, who was very well built and good-looking, stood up. He calmly covered himself, took the marijuana out of his mouth, and said, "Hey, what can I do for you guys?" Over the course of their conversation, the police would learn that this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel. He told the police that he was not anywhere near Joa's cabin on the night she went missing. The police, for whatever reason, ultimately bought his story. They confiscated his marijuana, walked back up the hill, took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left, leaving him down by the river. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators who had been called in on the case analyzed those pictures that the officers had taken of the tires on Kerry's car. They compared them to pictures of the tire tracks that had been found at Joe's cabin. And they determined that they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Kerry down again. This time, he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots, a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There, he was arrested on suspicion of murdering Joa Armstrong and was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was being booked, Kerry dropped a bombshell. He confessed. He confessed to not only murdering Joa Armstrong, but he also confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund and Silvina Palazzo, Julie's friend. And he said he did all of it on his own. He had no other accomplices. This meant the police had never had the killer behind bars. It would turn out that Eugene Dykes, one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about him and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, it turned out those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold type of blanket. They did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many of the people who lived in the area. And some people in the media had speculated Kerry would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession explaining exactly how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On the 14th of February, 1999, the day that Carol, Julie, and Silvina arrived at the Cedar Lodge, Kerry was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Kerry, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Kerry walked up the walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind. He was going to act on a dark fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. His plan that night was to go inside and not only kill his girlfriend, but also kill her 2 young daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out his plan, he noticed a man in their backyard through one of the windows. He asked his girlfriend who the guy was. She told him that she had hired someone to take care of the property, to cut the grass and do some work in the garden. She said he was going to be there for a little while, but he would stay outside. This totally screwed up Carrie's plan. He was not expecting anyone else to be there that night. So for several hours, Carrie anxiously sat there, constantly looking out the window, waiting for this man to leave so he could kill the 3 people inside. But the worker was taking a long time, and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. So finally, Carrie left without any explanation, angry and frustrated. He began driving back to the Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. When he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed a car he hadn't seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carrie had this urge to find out who owned that car. Maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned it, and maybe she was alone. If that was the case, he could still fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. So Carrie parked his car a little bit away from the red car, and he walked over to the motel room that was right in front of it. It was room 509. He peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up. And he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside the room. It was Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. Carrie stayed back, continuing to look through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside the room with them. After a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom, and with no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. So, when Carrie finally turned around and left to go back to his own room, he made the decision. He was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, February 15th, Carrie secretly followed the 3 women. When they hopped in their rental car and drove to Yosemite, he followed them. He followed them all the way to the parking lot inside the park, and then he waited in the parking lot for hours until the women had finished their wonderful day. He trailed them from the parking lot all the way back to the Cedar Lodge. He secretly followed them when they went to the diner and had hamburgers for dinner. He continued to follow them from a distance, and he watched them rent movies from the front desk. He followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside the room for the night, and he had watched long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his own apartment. He got his toolbox. Inside the toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. Around 11 p.m., he left his apartment, went downstairs, and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. He looked in the window, and it was totally dark inside. He assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door. She very cautiously opened it just a crack, leaving the chain lock still attached. She looked through the small opening at Carrie and said, "Hi, can I help you?" Carrie held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that identified him as the Cedar Lodge handyman. He said, "Hi, ma'am. Sorry to disturb you so late, but there's a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. Can I just come in and have a quick look? I'll be out of here in a minute." Carol, apparently, was not buying it. She said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one. But even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow? We're all trying to sleep." But Carrie was very persistent. And Carrie was known to be very charming and very disarming. Eventually, he talked his way into the room. He walked inside, past the bed where the 2 teenage girls were still sleeping. He went into the bathroom, and for a few minutes, he pretended to fiddle around with the plumbing, while Carol stood right outside the bathroom door looking in at him. Then, at some point, Carrie reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and aimed it at Carol. He said, "Stay calm. I'm not going to hurt you. This is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed that their best chance of getting out of this situation was to just comply. Do what he says, let him rob them, and then he would leave, and they would be okay. So Carol very dutifully went back into the room, and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend. Before long, Carrie had tied up all 3 of them. He put the 2 teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door. Then he put Carol on the bed. He then proceeded to assault Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. After she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. After he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room. He went to the bathroom, opened the door, and he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying. He pulled her out, leaving Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed, where he assaulted her before strangling her as well with additional rope. After Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside and put her in the trunk of the rental car, along with Carol's body. After that, he went back inside the motel room one more time. He opened the bathroom door, grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. While she was in there, wondering what was going to happen to her, what had happened to her mom, what had happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room. He tidied it up, moved all of their luggage out of the room, and put it into the rental car. After he was satisfied with the cleanup, he went back inside, opened the bathroom door, and pulled Julie out. He had her stand right outside the bathroom, as he then proceeded to clean up the bathroom itself, but he purposefully left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women had left in a bit of a hurry. After that, he grabbed Julie and walked her out to the car. He sat her down in the front passenger seat. She only had a blanket wrapped around her at this point. And then Carrie hopped in the driver's seat and began driving off into the night. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She had no idea where her mom was. She had no idea where her friend was. She had no idea they were actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. The man that had just assaulted her for hours was now driving her into the darkness, and she had no idea where she was going. All she had was a thin blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal to imagine what that poor girl was going through. For 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night. And the whole time, he was trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she was going to be okay and that her mom and her friend were going to be okay too. Finally, he pulled off the highway, drove down some switchbacks, and into the big, empty parking lot of Don Pedro Lake. He parked the car. There were no other cars around. It was still dark out, the sun hadn't come up yet. He got out and told Julie to get out of the car. But Julie was so scared, she was frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't even get out of the car on her own. So Carrie got out, walked around to her side, opened the door, and he scooped her up in his arms like you might hold a baby. He walked with her up a trail all the way to an overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. Once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and laid it down on the ground. And then he proceeded to assault her again. As the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover his tracks. So he stopped what he was doing. He stood up, reached down, and pulled Julie up to her feet. She was standing with her back to the lake. And as he was looking at her, he said, "I love you." And then he pulled out his knife and he cut her throat. He then pushed her body down the hillside, where she tumbled, and finally came to a stop underneath some bushes, where she died. Carrie grabbed the blanket from the ground and walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was still nobody out there. He hopped inside, drove out of the lot, and drove for 1 hour north until he was deep inside a forest. He pulled down a logging road where he abandoned the car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to the Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of a road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's bodies were found in the back of the burned-out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to the police, the one with the map of where Julie's body was, and that horrible message, "We had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to the police to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there was more than one person perpetrating these murders. Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carrie along with all the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. This was for 2 main reasons. One, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing such violence against 3 women. And 2, and this was probably the most important reason, The police discovered that when Carey was a child, his younger brother had been kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. Although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carey and his whole family. So the police figured there was no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knew firsthand how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carey seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save those 3 women from being abducted or harmed. In July of that year, 4 months after the 3 women's bodies were discovered, Carey, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, was just driving around Yosemite. He was reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out his fantasy and not get punished for it. That's when he noticed a woman, way off in the distance, walking in and out of a cabin that was fairly isolated. So he drove his 1,979 Blue International Scout down a forested road, and he reached a meadow. He looked across the meadow, and now that the woman was even closer, he could tell she was clearly loading things into her truck. She was going back and forth, and he's watching her, wondering if there's anybody else helping her because this cabin was very secluded. And he's thinking, if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. After a while, when he only saw her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decided he was going to go kill her. He drove across the meadow and pulled up right next to her truck. He got out and introduced himself. And the woman was so completely caught off guard by this random, strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she said, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" Carey proceeded to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. Then, at some point, Carey drew a pistol, aimed it at her, and said, "Go inside your cabin." So Joie put her hands up, and she went inside the cabin like she was told. Carey followed her inside. He then bound her wrists and her mouth with duct tape. He then ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. Once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carey got in the driver's seat and began leaving the cabin, headed back out towards the road he came in on. As he's speeding across the meadow, Joie leaps headfirst out of the window of the moving car and smashes onto the ground. She immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carey jams on the brakes, hops out, and starts chasing after her. Joie manages to get fairly close to the tree line right behind the cabin before Carey ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. Joie was viciously trying to fight Carey off of her, and Carey, kind of in a panic, drew his knife. He tried to slash at her, but Joie tucked her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. So, frustrated, Carey just stood up. He grabbed Joie by the hair and began hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. The whole time, Joie was doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just couldn't. Finally, they got inside the woods, and Carey dragged her into a ditch. Once she was down at the bottom, he put his foot on the top of her head and forced it back, forcibly exposing her throat. And at that point, he pulled out his knife, and he began to cut. Afterwards, Carey considered keeping Joie's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carey attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as it was, he left her cabin as it was. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. Carey would tell police that as soon as he killed Joie Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her 2 young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out that attack. Carey Stainer, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera. It was found intact near the burned-out car in the woods. The police developed the picture on the camera in the hopes that there would be some clue as to who murdered them. But it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful, happy time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Carey confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images on that camera roll, we know that Carey Stayner was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on that camera was taken by Julie. It's a picture of her mother sitting on one bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they were getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Carey knocked on their door. Before you click away tonight, just remember this. Somewhere in a police evidence box, there still exists a roll of photographs from that trip. Smiling faces. Snow-covered mountains. 3 people laughing together, completely unaware that the man who would murder them was already watching from the shadows. And in the very last photo ever taken, Carol and Sylvina are sitting quietly inside room 509, just moments before the knock came at the door. Until next time, sleep well.